Hello, and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I record this podcast at my church in Indianapolis, Indiana, but it's produced and distributed by the All Indiana Podcast Network. If you haven't heard of the All Indiana Podcast Network, you should know that they produce and distribute podcasts made and recorded in Indiana, my home state, by Hoosiers. That's what we call ourselves for some reason. And often, although not always, about topics of interest relevant to our state. But the topics run the gambit from religion like this one to sports to talks about money and everything in between. But in any case, Indiana resident or no, you should check them out. There's surely something there for you or for everyone. You can find them at www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. I mentioned my church briefly in passing at the beginning, that I pastor a church in Indianapolis. Well, it's called Northwood Christian Church. You can read about us and find recordings of lessons and sermons or information about our events by going to our website. That's www.indncc.org. That's INDYNCC.org. And pardon the sound of the sirens outside. I'm just going to keep going despite it. Lastly, if you're a regular listener who hasn't followed, liked, or subscribed to our podcast by way of whatever app you use to listen to podcasts, please do so. And if you're feeling especially spry, leave us a comment or a rating. My goodness. Maybe that'll make this more memorable, those sirens outside. What I'm trying to say is leave us a comment, leave us a rating, subscribe. All of these points of engagement are meant to bring more traffic our way, and for this, we'd be truly grateful. Now, here in a moment, and hopefully once the sirens have ceased, and God help whoever is being responded to by an emergency vehicle, but here in a moment, we'll be considering a reading from the Gospel of John. But before we do, we need to take a pause for our podcast audience. If this means you, we'll find you after these advertisements.
Okay, it's time to commit. 2024 is the year for prioritizing yourself. Begin your new smile journey with Byte, and you could start seeing results in just 2 to 3 weeks. Just order your at-home impression kit today for only $14.95 at Byte.com. Byte clear liners are doctor-directed and delivered to your door. Treatment costs thousands less than braces, plus they offer financing options, accept eligible insurance, and you could pay with your HSA, FSA. Get 80% off your impression kit when you use code WONDERY at Byte.com. That's BYTE.com. Start your confidence journey today with Byte.
And we're back. And as I was saying before, we'll be going over a passage found in the Gospel of John, more specifically John chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. That's John 6, 1 through 21, and it goes. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming towards him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 6 months' wages could not buy enough bread for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. When they were satisfied, he told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over, so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up And from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world." When Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, got into a boat, and started across the lake to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The lake became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the lake and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land towards which they were going. Well, there you heard it again, or at least the story about Jesus feeding the 5,000, not that last one. 2 stories, 2 miracle stories back to back. And if you feel like we have been stuck in the same story, there's a reason for that. 3 weeks ago, we considered this same feeding of the 5,000 story from another gospel's perspective, the Gospel of Mark, alongside the story of John the Baptist beheading. And we noted that in placing these 2 meals side by side in Mark's gospel, we can see the values of one of those meals set by Herod Antipas, the ruler, the king, and all of the governing officials and so-and-sos, fancy people. The local king who took the head of the prophet sets one kind of table. It takes the head of the prophet, and people are weighted hand and foot by the poor. Contrast that with the meal that Jesus set before the masses, the one you just read about. A generous meal that was presented to any and to all. At Herod's meal, the poor served the rich. At Jesus' meal, the disciples served the poor. For Jesus had told them that to be like him was to be the servant of all. Jesus meant it and demonstrated it and invited us into that life. So last week we read what came before and after that story of the feeding of the 5,000, but with it still hanging in the air. It was as if the gospel writer wanted us to see how these miracles may function outside of our church communities before and after they occur. The disciples, seeing the masses of poor like Jesus saw them, with new eyes to see them, like sheep without a shepherd, as the text reads in Mark chapter 6, or as people abused and misled by poor leadership and governance, which is what that really means, both poor governance in the religious and political institutions, corrupt, abusive, greedy, unholy, antichrist. And then the disciples then, though, had seen with new eyes and saw the people as Jesus saw them, who needed help, and then were called to meet them with the love of Christ. And so they did, and now here we are. Okay, good. But how? That's the question every generation faces. How do you do it logistically? Will we have enough? Will we be safe? These are the questions that arise in some people's mind when considering why or how to serve those in need. These 2 questions concerning having enough resources in the community, or else maybe we'll go without, or of the safety of the community. And if we bring strangers in to love, to care, will we get burnt? And those 2 questions are answered by these 2 of Jesus' most well-known miracles. And to tell those stories, the lectionary calls us away from Mark's gospel to the one we just read, John chapter 6, 1 through 21, where the story of Jesus' feeding of the 5,000 is told again, although with a few new details, and then is followed by the classic one where Jesus walks on water, although not the version where Peter is called out onto the waves himself. That's in Matthew chapter 14. But you just heard the one read in John. But first, there's that well-known, and by now, as I've been saying, overfamiliar story of Jesus feeding the thousands. I say overfamiliar because I feel as though we've been referencing it for weeks now in one way or another. But indulge me one last time. So here's a few points I want to make quickly about that story. First, Jesus assumes that they will feed the crowd, they being the disciples. He doesn't say, should we? Can we? He simply turns to Philip and asks, where are we going to get the food? Not how are we going to get the food, or is it our responsibility to get the food? Because to those questions, my thought is, what good is Jesus and what good are his disciples if it isn't to turn up in moments like these in important ways? But still, let's acknowledge the task is monumental, thousands in front of them. And look at us here. We still are thousands. And one disciple says it'd take a half year's wage just to give each person here a bite. Who's going to fit the bill was maybe the next question in someone's mind. So they might as well go home and call it a day, might be the implication. But that's not what happens. As the story unfolds, a boy is brought forward, and every kid in Sunday school growing up knew that he came with 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. Then they asked us children to be generous with our lunch money. But what was given freely turned out to be enough. What started out as small spread. The point, disciples take what they have, give it for the greater good, and then we discover how far it goes. And we've seen this happen recently at Northwood in many different ways in this past year, but more recently, an evicted family took temporary residence in our church, though they had nothing. Well, at least they thought. It was a veteran, his wife, and 3 kids, evicted on the 4th of July, I kid you not. But a community surrounded them in love and in resources. Our own versions of 5 loaves and 2 fish that we each found ways to give and stretched in ways profound and hard to pin down. And we've made new friends. I mean, Northwood, we have made new friends. This family, this lovely family, that they are now part of us. And we've given new hope to people who had none, but it's given us hope as well. The father of the family told me, though, and I want to share this, quoting him here, "I know this may sound weird," he said, "but all of this has somehow brought me closer to God and has restored my hope." End quote. And I'll go on to say what began as our own version of meager offerings blossomed into a renewed relationship with God in that man and in his family and a new hope. What price would you put on that? To put a bow on the first miracle story, the point is, I think, God has given us all we need. We just need to, like the boy in our story, offer it against all odds to see how we will discover ourselves to have more than enough together. For God has given us a planet with all that we need. So people in faith, we are called to live out of this truth. The next story, the walking on water story, should by now make some sense to most of us. In recent months, we've discussed how the sea, the wind, the waves had long stood as a metaphor for the chaotic forces of destruction and evil at play in the world. In Revelation 4, God is portrayed sitting in the heavenly throne room with a glassy sea at God's feet. And that's not, for the aesthetics. That's not just a nice thing to look at. The sea, a symbol of chaos, is smooth as smooth here because God has calmed the chaos. The sea is not a welcome presence, but in either way, should it be there, God has it under control. Now, with that kind of symbolism in mind, we can return to the story of Jesus walking on water to see what Jesus is teaching his disciples. This is the way they think of the sea stormy and tossing, a physical reminder of all that is wrong in the world, of what goes wrong down the road at Herod Antipas's party and the beheading of the prophet John the Baptist and everything else that's wrong. But Jesus treads atop of it. He is in command of these powers, even over the powers of chaos. Even whilst walking on the terrible waves, he is in charge. Later, even while hanging to death on a cross, he will remain someone in control. The point for his disciples that day, and for the church still today, is Jesus is Lord over the chaos and destructive forces in our world. We, the body of Christ, need not be afraid. That's what he told his disciples. First sentence out of his mouth, do not be afraid. Even should they hurt us, we need not be afraid. In the book of Acts, where we read of the early exploits of the church, we read of the 2 apostles, Paul and Silas, singing hymns in prison, not afraid. They themselves, now masters of the metaphorical waves. And the disciples in today's story saw how Jesus was not overwhelmed by the powerful forces of nature, but by this they discerned that no other power could overwhelm Jesus the Christ. So two messages in two miracle stories side by side. One, God will provide us what we need. We just need to turn up with what little we have. And two, Jesus is master over the chaotic forces of destruction in our world. Even though the world around us spins like crazy, we do not need to be afraid. The one who walks over chaos like it's nothing has our backs and dwells in us. We are the body of Christ, we believe. Even should we seem to be completely put under, as Jesus seemed on the cross, our faith calls us to hold on to the hope that will see us through to life on the other side of the tomb, Easter. Now, these two things I'm staking out, these claims I'm staking out, are both heartbreaking and major. I say major because, come on, if it were true that we needn't feel anxious about not having enough whilst confronting the danger in our world, then, others need to know about that if it's true. If it's true, then all that spins around us, assassination attempts more recently, wars abroad, and churning violence at home, market forces hurting some and helping others. I don't need to tell you that these are tumultuous times, and these times are calling many away from generosity and towards a greater stinginess and greed. That's what our time seems to be calling us towards, and towards fear and self-preservation. These times are calling us away from trust and towards mistrust and even violence, to violence. These times are, many feel as though, unprecedented, not much to hold on to. And then there's Jesus, walking on water, thumbing his nose at the danger. For to him, this is not the real danger. The real danger is in losing your soul in such times. There's Jesus and his friends giving what little they have, even when it isn't enough for themselves at the start. And what is discovered is that when shared, there is enough for everyone. What I'm trying to say is we are beholden to conflicting messages in the air today. There's the messaging of our times calling us toward a greater fear of our neighbors when Jesus told us not to be afraid, a greater fear of scarcity when Jesus has shown us that we have enough, and a greater fear of the chaos at large that we see on the news that overwhelms us. But then there's the messaging of Jesus calling us away from fear and into love for our neighbors and even love for our enemies, as well as hope in the midst of uncertainty. Hope that God will make all things new in the end, and that includes our lives. And whose message is right? Is Jesus' message here true? Is Jesus' teachings wisdom or folly? The answers to these questions are contained, I think, in the months and years to come. I think that we are about to find out if there's anything in this message of Jesus, or if those who are calling us away from it are right in the end. Would it have been better for us to hoard our resources this whole time? Is Jesus some loser who died long ago with nothing the world values left? Or did the one who fed thousands and mastered the calamity of the storms of his time prove us all wrong? As I said, we're about to find out. I think in the coming year or so, we will find out if Jesus' message may save us, or whether those who value profits over people and whose fear leads to hatred and violence, will they rule the earth and bring it down on our heads? Jesus says no. Just read the Sermon on the Mount. But who is right? Again, we are about to find out. But whose voice will you listen to? Given that you're listening to this on a church's podcast, you may well have already claimed your stake, or staked your claim. For you and me, it's Jesus all the way. I'm choosing to be generous, even when I have very little, to trust even those who may betray me or hurt me, and then to try to trust again, to try to love my enemies and to faithfully follow Jesus, even on top of these stormy and tossing seas of our times. For context, this is the end of July in the year 2024. Read about it. But my stake is with Jesus, the one who gives out of nothing to find there is enough, and who walks on the chaos, and it does not overwhelm him. This is because I know what I believe. I believe in the message of Jesus and where it may lead us. And if his promises are true, we can look forward with hope for whatever is coming next for the human race. This has been the Northwood Podcast. If you like what we're doing here, please subscribe to the podcast by way of whatever app you use to listen, or leave a comment. These points of engagement drive more traffic our way. Or check out our website, www.indyncc.org. And also check out the other podcasts produced by the All Indiana Podcast Network. Until next time, this has been the Northwood Podcast. I am Heath Jones. Peace.